Something was in that pasture. Not a wolf, not a bear, not anything with a name that holds up in daylight. The cattle weren't eaten. They were opened. 3 of them, in a circle, before dawn. And the thing that did it was still watching. It had been watching for 11 nights. It rearranged my survey stakes in the dark with more precision than I could manage with instruments in full sun. It left a handprint 9 feet up a wall. I'm not a man who embellishes. I am not a man who frightens easily. But I am a man who measures things for a living. And what I measured on that ranch in the autumn of 1897 does not fit inside any category I was trained to use. My name is Edmund Harlan Cole. I am 71 years old. I spent 30 years as a licensed land surveyor for Fairfax County, New Mexico, 30 years of boundary lines, deed descriptions, disputed fences, and contested pasture. I arrived at the Wallace Ranch on the 14th day of October, 18. Sent out on a routine assignment to settle a grazing boundary dispute. I stayed for 18 days. What I found there, I have never entered into any official record, until now. The high plains of Fairfax County don't announce themselves. They flatten out below the Sangre de Cristo, foothills like something that ran out of ambition, and they stretch in every direction with the kind of patience that only land holds, and the patience of something that was there long before the people who decided to name it, and will be there long after the last fence post rots into the ground. The Wallace family had been running cattle on that stretch since 1879, nearly 2 decades. By every account in the county record, it was a clean, quiet operation, and 300 head of Hereford stock, a solid adobe and timber main house, 2 hired hands who slept in a shed behind the barn, and a family that paid its fees on time and didn't generate paperwork, the kind of ranch that makes a county surveyor's job feel almost peaceful. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, riding out from town with my chain, my rods, and my notebook, expecting to spend 2 days settling a boundary question involving the northern pasture and an adjacent federal grazing allotment. 2 days, maybe 3. A handshake, a corrected fence line, a filed report. That was the job. What I did not know when I turned my horse up the wagon road toward the Wallace Gate was that the family inside that house had not slept properly in 11 days. Elias Wallace met me at the gate on horseback, which struck me as unusual immediately. The boundary line in question was a 10-minute walk from the house. There was no reason for a man to ride out to meet a surveyor at his own front gate unless something had altered his relationship to the open land between the 2 points. He was a lean man in his mid-40s, with the kind of economy of movement that either means a man is deeply calm or deeply spent. That morning the distinction wasn't subtle. His eyes had the particular flatness you see in men who have stopped expecting the day to bring them anything good. He shook my hand with a firm, practiced grip and said nothing at all about the survey. What he said instead was this: "You're going to hear things tonight. I want you to hear them from me first." I accepted his invitation to dinner. Over salt pork and cornbread, Elias Wallace told me what had been happening on his land, and I sat across from him with my coffee and gave him the careful, neutral attention I had learned to give to men presenting me with contested information, which is to say, I listened without committing to belief. His wife, Margaret, sat at the far end of the table and watched the window, not glancing at it, watching it. She was a solid, capable woman, perhaps 40 years old, with the red hands of someone who worked without complaint, and the careful eyes of someone who had learned that complaint changed nothing. She did not speak while her husband talked. She kept her focus on the dark rectangle of glass at the end of the room, as though she expected it to produce something. The 2 hired men, Dawson Aurelio, finished their food quickly and left the table before the sun had fully gone down. Neither of them offered an explanation. Neither of them was asked for one. The trouble, Elias told me, had started 11 nights before my arrival. He had been woken before dawn by a sound from the south pasture. He described it as a prolonged tearing, wet, rhythmic, patient, the kind of sound something makes when it is working at a carcass without urgency, as though the work itself is the point. He had taken his rifle and walked out into the dark. What he found were 3 of his cattle dead, in a pattern he could not account for. They hadn't been dragged. They hadn't been scattered. They hadn't been consumed in any way that suggested feeding. There was no territorial marking, no opportunistic scavenging at the edges, nothing that pointed toward hunger as a motivation. They had been opened. He used that word deliberately. And when I asked him to clarify, he repeated it without elaboration. Opened, as though whatever had done this was interested in what the animals contained rather than in consuming them, as though the purpose was examination. He had found the tracks in the dirt around the carcasses, a wide circling arc that converged on the 3 bodies and then retreated north toward the base of the Sangre de Cristo foothills. His first instinct was bear, though the altitude and the season made that unlikely. His hired man Aurelio, who had worked cattle drives through the Cimarron country for 3 years, before coming to the Wallace Ranch, crouched over the prints for a long moment and said nothing. When Elias pressed him, Aurelio looked up and said, "That is not a bear track. A bear track has a heel." He pointed to the rear of the impression, where the heel should have registered in the soft earth, and where instead the depression suggested something that distributed its weight differently, something that stood more upright, carried itself with a balance that did not match any animal Aurelio had encountered in 20 years of outdoor work. The second attack came 3 nights later. Same crescent moon, same pre-dawn hour. 2 more cattle opened the same way, same deliberate quality to the damage, same absence of feeding behavior. Elias rebuilt the fence and moved the remaining herd closer to the main buildings. He positioned his hired man Doss on the barn roof with a rifle and a lantern. Doss was not an excitable man. Elias described him as the kind of person who could watch a tornado approach and take notes. He was valued precisely because he did not alarm easily and did not dramatize what he saw. Doss saw nothing that second night, but he heard something that shook him down to the foundation. From beyond the north fence line, from the direction of the rocky drainage channel that marked the edge of the property, came a sound that Doss described the next morning as a man crying, but wrong. The vocalization had the cadence of human weeping, the rise, the fall, the ragged catch of exhaustion, but at a register and a volume that no human throat should be capable of producing. It lasted approximately 2 minutes, then stopped, and then there was silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a high plains night. Elias was careful to make this distinction, and Doss confirmed it separately. Complete silence. The kind of silence that was wrong because it was too thorough. No insects. No small rustlings. No distant animal movement. None of the constant, low-level sound that living land produces without thinking about it. That silence lasted until dawn. Doss told Elias the following morning that he would sooner quit than spend another night alone on that roof. I listened to all of this over my coffee and gave it the weight that a rational man of 30 years field experience gives to frightened accounts from isolated people. Partial credit? Men in remote places hear things that daylight rearranges into more sensible shapes. I had surveyed enough backcountry to understand that the land has its own acoustics, its own logic, its own scale, and that men routinely mistake these things for something they are not. But what would it take to change that assessment? What single piece of evidence would shift a careful man's interpretation from frightened and mistaken to something else entirely? I was about to find out. The following morning, I rose before the house was fully awake, pulled on my coat against the October cold, and went out to begin the actual work I had been sent to do, the survey of the northern pasture boundary. I had driven stakes into the ground the previous afternoon at dusk, marking my preliminary reference points along the fence line, closest to the federal allotment. Standard practice, precisely placed. Each one recorded in my notebook with its corresponding chain measurement. I found them pulled out, not knocked over, not scattered by wind or animal, not disturbed in any way that suggested accident or carelessness, pulled cleanly from the ground and arranged in a straight line, along the fence, each stake set upright in a new hole, each hole precisely the same distance from the last. I stood at that fence line for a long time. Then I took out my surveying chain and measured the spacing, equidistant, each interval identical to within a fraction of an inch. I'm a man who has spent 30 years measuring things for a living. I know what precision looks like. and I know how difficult it is to achieve, even in daylight. With instruments, with time to check your work. What I was looking at on that fence line had been done in the dark, on a night when the crescent moon set before midnight and left. The pasture in near total blackness. The spacing was more accurate than most trained surveyors could produce under ideal conditions. I stood there in the cold morning light with my chain in my hands, and I thought about what that meant. Then I walked back to the house and sat with my coffee for a while before I told Elias. He listened without surprise. He didn't lean forward or change his expression or ask me to repeat myself. He sat with the quiet of a man who had already processed his last surprise 11 days ago and had since moved into a different relationship with the information his land was producing. It's been doing things like that, he said, showing us it's paying attention. That sentence landed differently than I expected it to, because here's what the rearranged stakes implied that the cattle killings alone had not. Deliberate intelligence. An animal kills for reasons that an experienced outdoorsman can interpret. Territory, hunger, fear, those are motivations a human mind can map onto animal behavior and find a shape that holds. But rearranging survey stakes with geometric precision serves no purpose a predator would recognize. There is no food in it, no territorial advantage, no defensive benefit. It is communication. It is the act of something that wants you to know it has been present, that it examined your work, that it has some concept of order, and chose to demonstrate that concept to you, specifically in a language it correctly identified as yours. That understanding settled into me, the way cold settles into a building when the fire goes low. Not fast, not with drama, just steadily, 1 degree at a time until you realize the room has changed. I completed my preliminary boundary walk that day and said nothing more about the stakes to anyone other than Elias. I began noting measurements more carefully in my private notebook, not the official survey record, but a second notebook I carried for personal field observations. Stride patterns in the soft earth near the drainage channel, distances between points of disturbance, the geometry of the cattle killings as Elias had described them. I am a surveyor. When I encounter something I don't understand, I measure it. It is the only tool I have that I fully trust. On the third night of my stay, I heard it myself. I had taken a position near the kitchen window at Elias's suggestion. He had adopted a rotation of watches since the second attack, with someone awake and positioned near a window or door at all times. Through the dark hours, I was not armed. I had not brought a firearm, as I had not expected to need one, and I did not ask to borrow one because I was not certain it would have been useful. What I heard came from the direction of the drainage channel, sometime around midnight. It began as a low vibration, more felt than heard, a resonance that seemed to exist below the threshold of clear sound. The way certain pipe organs in certain churches produce notes, the ear processes as pressure rather than pitch. Then it resolved gradually into something more organized. I will not describe it as a voice. I am not willing to use that word without qualification. What I will say is that it had the structured quality of vocalization and the rhythmic variation, the dynamic shifts, the suggestion of deliberate modulation, without corresponding to any register I had ever encountered from any source, human or animal. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes, then the silence came. The same silence Doss had described. Total, immediate, the kind of silence that is a presence rather than an absence. The silence of a place where every living thing with the instinct to be quiet has gone quiet at once. I stayed at the window until dawn. In the morning, I walked the fence line nearest the drainage and found new tracks in the frost-softened earth along the northern boundary. This was the first time I was able to examine the impressions myself rather than relying on Elias's description, and I spent considerable time on my knees in the cold mud with my notebook and my measuring tape. The stride length was 60 inches. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A stride, not a step, a stride. The distance from the heel of one foot to the heel of the same foot and of 60 inches, 5 feet. The stride of a man walking normally is approximately 30 inches. The stride of a man running is perhaps 50. What I was measuring in that frost-cold earth along the Wallace fence line was a bipedal stride of 60 inches at what the depth of the impressions and the spacing of the gait pattern indicated was a walking pace. I measured it 4 times. I got the same result 4 times. The heel impression was present. Aurelio had noted its absence in the earlier tracks, the ones from the first attack, and attributed that to the ground conditions at the south pasture. Here, in the frost-softened earth along the drainage, the heel was clear. What was also clear was the configuration of the forefoot. Broader than a human foot, the weight distributed differently. The toe impressions, spaced in a way that suggested both proportion and an anatomy that was close to human in its general structure but not identical in its specifics. Close to human. That phrase is the most precise language I have for it, and I am a man whose profession is precision. That afternoon, Elias's hired man Doss came to me with something he had found that morning in the shed behind the barn, a handprint in the dried mud of the shed wall where the rain had come off the roof and softened the adobe before freezing. He had not touched it. He had come directly to me. It was at a height of 9 feet from the ground. The palm was 14 inches wide. I measured it with the same care I had given the tracks. I measured it 3 times. The result did not change. 9 feet, 14 inches. And here is what I had not yet told Elias. What I had not told anyone. Because I was still in the process of deciding what my measurements were telling me. In the Cimarron country oral accounts that Aurelio had mentioned in passing over dinner the previous evening, there were descriptions, old descriptions from the Spanish colonial period, from the pre-territorial surveys, from accounts recorded by early land grant administrators who had no reason to invent them. The descriptions matched what I was measuring, which meant this was not new, which meant it had been here before, and which meant the question I needed to ask was not what is it, but rather, what does it want and why has it been watching the Wallace family specifically, on this specific piece of land, with this specific precision and patience? That question would not let me leave. His name was Briggs. That was the name Aurelio gave me, a single name, offered reluctantly, late on the 4th evening of my stay, when the darkness had come down fully and the temperature had dropped enough that the men gathered near the stove in the main house out of practical necessity rather than sociability. Aurelio had grown up on the eastern edge of the Cimarron country. He was a compact, quiet man in his late 30s, with a precision of speech that suggested a careful mind, the kind of man who selected words rather than reaching for the first ones available. He did not speak often. When he did, the people around him tended to stop what they were doing and listen, not because he demanded attention, but because he had established, through consistent accuracy, that what he said was worth hearing. He told me about a land grant surveyor named Briggs who had worked the Cimarron territory in the years before. New Mexico's territorial government was fully organized. A man whose job, like mine, had been to walk contested land and record what was there. Briggs had kept a field ledger. That ledger, Aurelio told me, had been in the possession of a family in the Cimarron Valley, a family with land grant connections, and he had seen it himself. As a young man, shown to him by an elderly relation, who had considered it important enough to preserve and dangerous enough not to discuss openly. Aurelio remembered specific entries, not the precise language but the content, the stride lengths, the pre-dawn timing, the deliberate quality of the animal deaths, opened, not consumed, the sounds at night that combined human, vocal cadence with a register no human throat could achieve, the silence afterward, the withdrawal that eventually came, without explanation after a period of observation, and one detail that Briggs had recorded which Aurelio had not yet mentioned to anyone on the Wallace property, because he had not been certain, until my measurements, that it was the same thing. The geometric precision. Briggs had noted in his field ledger that his survey markers had been rearranged, precisely, in the dark, in a pattern that reflected an understanding of the measurement system he was using. I sat with that information for a long time, because what it meant, if Aurelio's account of the ledger was accurate, was that this was not random. This was not a territorial predator that happened to intersect with human settlement. It had done this before, in the same region, with the same specific attention to whoever was doing the measuring. It had engaged with the surveyor's work, specifically twice now, separated by decades. It recognized the instruments of land measurement. It understood what they represented, and it chose both times to respond in the language of those instruments. I asked Aurelio how Briggs's account had ended. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove popped once. He left, Aurelio said. He finished his survey and filed his report and never worked that territory again. And the thing in the drainage, it left too after a while. The ledger said it left when the work was done. When the work was done, I thought about that for the rest of the evening, and I did not sleep much that night. Not because of fear in the ordinary sense, but because my mind kept returning to the same implication, circling it the way the tracks circled the cattle, deliberately, patiently from a wide angle. The thing in the drainage had begun its activity 11 nights before my arrival. It had escalated during my first days at the property. It had rearranged my equipment specifically. Not Elias's tools, not Doss's rifle, not Aurelio's gear, mine, the surveyor's. And according to Briggs's ledger, it had done this before and to another surveyor. In this same territory, in this same pre-dawn rhythm, was it possible that what was happening at the Wallace Ranch had less to do with the Wallace family than with the act of surveying itself? Was the land being measured the provocation, or was it the measurer? On the 5th night of my stay, the situation changed. Margaret Wallace was the one who came for me. Past midnight, moving through the dark hallway of the main house with a lamp held low, her face carrying the particular composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only useful thing left. She knocked at the door of the room I had been given and said, in a voice she was keeping carefully level, "There is something at the back of the house. It's been there for some time." I dressed and followed her to the kitchen. She was right. Something was there. I could hear it before. I reached the door, not the vocalization I had heard from the drainage, but something quieter and closer. A sound at the threshold of audibility, deep and rhythmic, almost like breathing but with a cadence that was too slow for any normal respiratory cycle. And beneath it, or perhaps within it, a smell that came through the gap at the base of the kitchen door. Old and organic and warm in a way that did not belong to the October cold outside. It was the smell of something that had been alive for a very long time. I did not open the door. I stood 2 feet from it, fully dressed, with a lamp in my hand, and I listened. It knew I was there. I am certain of that. The quality of the sound at the door changed when I approached. A slight modulation, a shift in the rhythm, subtle enough that I might have dismissed it as imagination if I had not. By that point, spent 4 days developing a very precise ear for the patterns of sound this thing produced. It registered my presence. It adjusted to it. We stood on opposite sides of a wooden door for perhaps 4 minutes. Then it left. I heard it go. Not running, not retreating in alarm, moving away with the same deliberate, unhurried pace that its track suggested. The warmth and smell receded together. The breathing sound diminished, and then the silence returned. Brief this time, less than a minute, before the ordinary night sounds of the plains came back in the way they always came back when the extraordinary thing that had been displacing them had moved on. Margaret was standing behind me. She hadn't moved. "It's been to the door before," she said. 3 times. Always past midnight. Always this door. I asked her why she hadn't mentioned it when Elias was telling me the full account at dinner. She was quiet for a moment. "Because telling it makes it more real," she said. "And we have children in this house." I wrote down the time, the duration, the smell, the sound characteristics, and the direction of departure in my private notebook. I included a note that this was the closest proximate contact I had documented, and that the entity had demonstrated awareness of my presence at a distance of approximately 2 feet through a solid wood door, and had modulated its behavior in response. 2 feet, that was the distance between us. And then the next morning, I found something that made all of my measurements feel suddenly and completely inadequate. On the east wall of the adobe shed behind the barn, at a height of 9 feet and 3 inches from the base of the wall, there was a palm print, not the one Doss had found in the dried mud. That one I had already measured and recorded. This was a second impression on the opposite wall, in a section of adobe that had been freshly damp from a leak in the roof and had since dried. The print was complete. Full palm, all 5 digits, the heel of the hand, the lateral edge. Complete contact, clean impression. I measured it 4 times, from 4 angles, with 2 different instruments. Palm width, 14¼ inches. Finger length index, 7 inches. Span from heel of palm to tip of middle finger, 21 inches. I stood on an overturned water trough to take the measurements at eye level, which gave me a reference point for the reach required to produce the print. Whatever had made it had not needed to stand on anything. It had placed its hand against that wall, at 9 feet and 3 inches of elevation, from a standing position, which meant whatever produced it stood, at minimum, well above the reach of any man I had encountered in my life. and likely above the reach of any man documented in any record I was aware of. I went through the calculation in my notebook. Hand span of 21 inches, assuming proportional relationship between hand size and height consistent with general primate anatomy, a rough calculation. I acknowledge that freely. Rough but not worthless. The height suggested was significant. I wrote down the number. I looked at the number for a long time. Then I continued working. The shed's interior showed additional evidence that morning that I had not examined carefully before. Along the lower section of the north wall, at floor level, there was a series of impressions in the dirt, where the shed's earthen floor had been softened by the same roof leak, partial track impressions overlapping, the complete picture obscured by the angle of entry and exit. But what was visible was consistent with the tracks. I had measured along the drainage fence line, the same stride geometry, the same weight distribution pattern. The thing had been inside the shed, not recently. The impressions had dried fully, which placed them at least 2 days prior, possibly more. But at some point during the 11 nights before my arrival, or during the 5 nights since, it had entered a man-made structure. A small one, low-ceilinged, barely 6 feet from floor to rafters, which meant whatever entered had needed to accommodate itself considerably to do so. That detail altered my understanding of the situation in a specific way. It was not avoiding human spaces, it was entering them, choosing to. That afternoon I found Aurelio sitting alone behind the barn, facing the drainage channel, watching the foothills the way a man watches something he expects to see again. I sat down beside him and told him what I had found in the shed. He listened without interrupting. Then he told me the rest of what he knew from Briggs's ledger, the part he had held back the previous evening. In the final entries of the ledger, Briggs had described a night when the thing had come close enough to his campfire that he could see it in the peripheral light, not clearly on the darkness and the fire's angle, and his own shock had combined to produce an impression rather than a detailed image. But Briggs had written it down, upright, fully bipedal, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested a mass inconsistent with human proportion. The face, Briggs had written that the face was wrong in a specific way, that it was close enough to a human face that the wrongness was more disturbing than outright difference would have been. The uncanny valley, we might call it now, but Briggs, in 1871, had no such language. He had only written that it looked at him with eyes that had the quality of assessment, not aggression, not hunger, pure structured attention. Like it was deciding something, Aurelio said, quoting what he remembered of the ledger's language, and hadn't decided yet. That phrase matched what Elias had said to me on the first evening, showing us it's paying attention. It hadn't occurred to me until that moment, sitting behind the barn with Aurelio in the October afternoon, that being paid attention to by something intelligent is a different category of experience than being stalked by something. Hungry, a predator's attention has a single endpoint. The attention Briggs had described, the attention I had been experiencing through the stake rearrangement and the door encounter, had no endpoint I could identify. It was open-ended attention, the attention of something that had not yet finished, evaluating what it was looking at. That evening I suggested to Elias that we fortify, not because I believed the thing intended harm in the direct, predatory sense. Nothing in its behavior had pointed clearly toward that, but because we had children in the house in a situation that had been escalating in proximity, and because the responsible action was to reduce access while we remained uncertain about intent. Elias agreed immediately. He had been thinking the same thing for days. We spent the following day reinforcing the shed, the barn, and the immediate perimeter of the main house. Heavy timbers across the shed doors, new latches on the barn from the inside. We filled gaps in the adobe of the outbuildings where the roof leaks had been, not because we believed the thing required a gap to enter, but because the work gave the family something purposeful to do, and purposeful work is its own form of stability. Margaret organized the inside of the house with the efficiency of someone who had been mentally preparing for this for days. Supplies consolidated, lamps filled and positioned. The 2 boys, Thomas, 12, and James, 9, assigned specific tasks and given the dignity of being useful rather than being protected, so overtly that their fear had no productive outlet. Children who have lived inside a crisis long enough stop performing fear. Elias told me that evening. They become functional within it. He didn't say whether he thought that was a mercy or a warning. We kept watch in rotation. Elias and I through the first half of the night, Margaret through the second. On the night of the fortification, the thing came to the south side of the house, not the kitchen door, the south wall, the wall facing the pasture where the first cattle had been found. We heard it at approximately 2 in the morning, the same deep rhythmic presence, this time accompanied by a sound against the exterior adobe, low and slow, that I can only describe as the sound of something being felt rather than examined, a palm perhaps, moving across the surface of the wall, patient, thorough, as if mapping the structure from outside. It lasted 11 minutes, I counted. Then it withdrew to the drainage, and the silence came. And then the planes returned to their ordinary sound. In the morning, on the south wall at a height of 9 feet, there was a second handprint, which meant it had pressed its hand against the wall of the house, while we slept 4 feet away on the other side, and it had done it gently enough that we had not been certain it was happening. What does something want that brings it that close, that carefully, to a wall with sleeping people on the other side, and then leaves without breaking through? After the handprint on the south wall, everything changed, not in the dramatic sense, not in the sense that anything accelerated into violence or rupture. The change was quieter than that, and in some ways more unnerving because of its quietness. What changed was the thing's relationship to distance. It stopped keeping to the drainage channel. In the first 11 days of its activity, before my arrivals, it had operated primarily from the north, using the rocky drainage as what I had come to think of as a baseline, moving from that position to the south pasture for the cattle, retreating back, maintaining a pattern that had a perimeter to it, a boundary it respected even while violating the property's own boundaries. That perimeter had been shrinking since my arrival. In increments I had been tracking: the fence line, the shed, the kitchen door, the south wall. Each point of contact was closer than the last. I laid out my notes on the kitchen table after Margaret and the boys had gone to sleep, and Elias sat across from me, and I showed him the progression, the way a man shows another, data that speaks for itself, without requiring editorial commentary. He looked at the sequence for a long time. "It's moving toward the house," he said. "It has been moving toward the house," I said. "Consistently, over 22 days. Does Aurelio's account say what Briggs did at this point?" It did. Briggs had done what I was inclined to do. He had moved toward it. Not aggressively, not armed, not in any way that could be interpreted as challenge. He had walked out toward the drainage with his instruments, in the early morning light, and conducted his survey from a position closer to the presence than he had worked from before. And the activity had decreased, not immediately, but within 2 days of that approach, the proximity escalation had leveled, and within a week, the withdrawal had begun. Whether there was causation in that sequence or merely correlation, Briggs had not claimed to know. He had recorded it. He had noted that moving toward the thing, in the context of his work, with his instruments, doing exactly what a surveyor does, appeared to have communicated something that the fortification and the watches and the rifles had not. I am not a man who makes decisions based on the field, notes of a surveyor I have never met, relayed through the memory of a hired hand who read a ledger as a young man. I want to be precise about that. What I made my decision on was the pattern my own measurements had produced, combined with the one consistent fact in everything I had observed. Whatever this thing was, it was specifically attentive to the survey work, the stakes, the instruments, the measurements. Every direct engagement it had made with me specifically, not with Elias, not with Doss, not with the family, had been through the language of my profession. It was responding to the measurement. So the next morning, before the rest of the house had fully wakened, I took my chain, my rods, my notebook, and my compass, and I walked north across the frost-gray pasture toward the drainage channel. I did not take a rifle. The morning was very cold and very clear, the kind of October morning in New Mexico where the air has a precision to it, a sharpness at the edges of things, and the foothills stand out against the blue sky with the hard clarity of cut stone. I walked at a deliberate pace. I set my rods in the ground at measured intervals. I ran my chain. I recorded figures in my notebook. I did the work I had come to do, in the place where the thing had been, because the logic I was operating on, the only logic I had with sufficient evidential support, said that doing my work in that place was the correct response to what had been happening. I worked for 3 hours without incident. In that time, I was not aware of being watched in the acute, pressurized way I had felt during the night encounters. What I was aware of was a quality of attention that I can only describe as ambient, diffuse, present, not concentrated into the pointed observation of the encounters at the shed and the kitchen door. The land around me had the feeling of a room in which someone is present but not looking directly at you. I returned to the house for midday. I went out again in the afternoon. I completed the boundary measurements for the northern pasture, the work I had originally been sent to do. By the time the light began to fail and I drove my final stakes into the frozen earth at the fence line's northern terminus, I had a complete professional survey of the contested boundary, clean numbers, accurate to my usual standard. That night, for the first time in 22 nights, nothing came to the drainage. No sound, no presence, silence, no smell at the kitchen door, no marks in the morning. The first night's quiet was not enough to mean anything. I had been at the Wallace Ranch long enough to know that a single quiet night was evidence of nothing. But the second night was also quiet. And the third, on the morning of the third quiet day, Elias walked the northern boundary as far as the drainage. He came back and reported that the tracks along the fence line were old. Weather softened, filling with wind-blown dust. Nothing new. He walked the full perimeter of the property. And I went with him, chain in hand, completing my documentation, and we found nothing that should not have been there. The drainage was empty, not the deliberate emptiness of a presence suppressing the land's ambient sound, ordinary emptiness, the kind of emptiness a place has when the thing that was displacing the small animals has moved on, and the rabbits and the ground squirrels have come back to fill the space it left. I stayed 3 more days after that, watching the silence to see if it would change back. It didn't. On the morning I was ready to leave, I sat at the kitchen table with Elias for the last time, and we talked about what he was going to do with the ranch. He was not certain, he said. He would try another season, see what the spring brought. The cattle losses had been manageable. 9 head over the course of the activity, which was a hit but not a devastation. The family was intact. The land was still producing. He did not ask me what I thought the thing was. I did not offer a conclusion. What I offered instead, and what I believed he needed more than my interpretation, was the one thing I was professionally equipped to give. I told him that the sequence of events I had observed, and the pattern of withdrawal following the resumption of survey work, was consistent with the sequence Briggs had recorded in the Cimarron territory 26 years prior, that it appeared to be a cycle, that the cycle appeared to have an endpoint, that the endpoint appeared to be connected to the completion of the measurement work, to the documentation of the land being finished and the measurer being ready to leave. Whether that was causation or correlation, I told him honestly, I could not say. What I could say was what my measurements indicated, and my measurements indicated that whatever had been here, for however long, in whatever capacity, and had withdrawn once before under nearly identical conditions, and had withdrawn again, and had left the land the way all things eventually leave the land they move through, without explanation, without resolution, and without the courtesy of an answer to the question it had spent 22 nights placing in front of every person on that property. What does it want? That question does not have a surveyor's answer. But the measurements do not lie. If this account stayed with you, if something about the precision of those measurements won't let you go, hit subscribe. We find the cases where the numbers exist, the witnesses were serious, and the official record chose silence. There are more accounts like this one. You won't want to miss them.